Hi students, Jordan here and welcome back to Bio 25 Online. Hopefully you've all taken your first online lab exam and hopefully you've all done well. If you have any questions about the exam, feel free to reach out via email or text. I'd be happy to answer those questions. And without further ado, we're just going to resume online instruction. So today we'll be covering Lab 18, which talks about the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord. This is actually the first lab that I ever taught as a GTA, so it has a very special place in my heart. And let's just get into the video.
Today we'll be discussing Lab 18, which covers the anatomy of the spinal cord and brain. So we have a couple objectives today. By the end of this video, you should be able to name the major regions of the adult spinal cord, name the major regions of the adult brain, describe the connections between the cerebrum and brainstem, and from those regions into the spinal cord, and finally you should be able to recognize the complex connections within the brain. Today we'll be working out of pages 103 and 104 in your lab manual, so I think now would be a great time for you to all open up to those pages and follow along throughout the lecture. So what does the human central nervous system even look like? It actually looks something like this. It's kind of crazy to think that this is what's inside of you right now, and this is what's basically controlling everything you do. Now on to the fun stuff. We'll be talking first about the regions of the spinal cord. So as you can see here, we have the cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargements, and these enlargements just correspond to those regions of the spinal cord. Next, we have what's called the conus medullaris, which is the cone-like tip of the end of the spinal cord, and that gives rise to the cauda equina, which is basically this horsetail-like structure, all the little endings that are coming off of the spinal cord. And then finally we have the filum terminale, which is this fiber that runs all the way down and is anchored to the coccyx. So you might be following along and thinking, but wait, where are the denticulate ligaments? Well, we're actually going to talk about that right now. So the denticulate ligaments look a little bit like this, and basically what they are is they're these bands of pia mater that extend along the spinal cord on each side, and they actually divide the dorsal roots from the ventral roots. So here's an unlabeled picture of what we just talked about, and now might be a good time to pause the video and work on identifying the structures listed on page 103 that we've talked about so far. Next, we're going to talk about the spinal cord a little bit more zoomed in. This is actually a cut through the spinal cord, and you can see there's some different structures labeled here, so we're going to go through them. First, we have our posterior median sulcus and anterior median fissure. These are just anatomical landmarks that we use when we talk about the spinal cord. Next, we have the dorsal column, lateral column, and ventral column, followed by the dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn. This structure often gets compared to a butterfly, and hopefully you can appreciate that, and maybe it can help you remember these structures. Next, we have commissures, as you can see in the middle, and finally we have the central canal. Moving on, we have the dorsal root coming off of the dorsal horn. Then we have the dorsal root ganglion, which is that bulb-like extension of the dorsal root. And those structures feed into the spinal nerve, followed by the ventral root on the other side. So just continuing to talk about this, we have what are called rami communicantes. I know that's a fun word to say, but basically this is just what connects the spinal cord to the autonomic nervous system. You can also see the ventral ramus and dorsal ramus in this image. And remember, that's just another word for arm-like projection. Finally, you can see the denticulate ligaments in this cartoon format, so maybe make note of that here. So here's a picture of a spinal cord model with all those structures that we just talked about labeled. I would expect you to know something like this in this format. And now we can see kind of that same deal, same thing going on, just with different structures labeled, but the same model. So now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the brain. First, we're going to talk about the different lobes of the brain, and hopefully this should come kind of naturally to you because we've already learned about these bones of the skull. So we have the frontal lobe, which is in the frontal region, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe, and all of these lobes correspond to their regions within the brain. Next, we have what's called the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, and hopefully you can see them in these pictures as they're labeled with different colors. Between those two structures, we have what's called the central sulcus. Next, we have the lateral sulcus, which is kind of that invagination between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. Next, we have this structure on the bottom here called the cerebellum. And next to that, we have what's called the pons and the medulla oblongata. Between the cerebellum and the upper portion of the brain, which you'll later find out is called the cerebrum, we have what's called the transverse fissure. So here's a labeled picture of a brain model, kind of showing you an outline of what those structures look like in a model sense. So now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the diencephalon and the brainstem. So what you see here is representative of the diencephalon and the brainstem. We have a couple structures you need to know: the thalamus, the midbrain, these two gem-like structures on the back called the corpora quadrigemina, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. I threw up this meme from The Waterboy. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that movie, but in it they talk about the medulla oblongata and it's kind of funny. Okay, next we've taken our brain and we have sliced it in half, and now we are looking into the brain, so hopefully you can appreciate that. As you can see, there are some structures here that you need to know. Let's start with the corpus callosum, which is the connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. Below that, we have the fornix, followed by the thalamus and the intermediate mass. Next, we have the pineal gland, and now we're going to go to the bottom half of this picture. We have what are called the mammillary bodies, the infundibulum, which is the hose-like connection that leads to the pituitary gland. Hopefully you guys remember the pituitary gland from when we learned about the sphenoid bone. Next, we have the hypothalamus, and finally we have the anterior commissure. So remember that structure we talked about, the cerebellum? When you cut the cerebellum in half, you actually have this structure here called the arbor vitae, which is Latin for the tree of life, and I think that's pretty cool. So now here's a picture of those structures we just talked about labeled on a model. If you guys want, feel free to pause the video and study these structures now. Just continuing, this picture shows the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, and the pituitary gland, all very important structures within the brain. So now we're going to talk about these structures called ventricles. Basically, ventricles are responsible for housing cerebrospinal fluid within our brains. So we can see this structure here kind of looks like ram horns is what it's often compared to. And I'll just walk you through real quick. First, we have our lateral ventricles. Then we have what's called the interventricular foramen, followed by the third ventricle down to the cerebral aqueduct. And finally on the bottom, there's the fourth ventricle. This picture is kind of just giving you a different perspective of that. It looks a little bit more like ram horns here, but hopefully you can just appreciate from top to bottom, we're going lateral ventricles, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and fourth ventricle. So last but not least, you might be thinking, Jordan, what makes the cerebrospinal fluid? And it's actually this grainy structure within the ventricles called the choroid plexus. Lastly, we're going to talk about the different layers that surround the brain. We actually have three of them: the pia mater, arachnoid mater, and dura mater. You can kind of see them in these pictures here, but pia mater is the layer that's closest to the brain, followed by arachnoid mater, which you can often recognize because it kind of looks like a spider web, hence the word arachnoid. And finally, we have the dura mater, which is the outermost layer, and dura mater literally translates to tough mother, so hopefully you can appreciate that it's a really dense membrane. And finally, for fun, instead of our fun anatomy fact of the day, we're just going to talk about some different models of brain disease. So you've spent this entire slideshow looking at what a normal brain looks like. So I've thrown up some pictures of brains that aren't so normal, so you can kind of appreciate how devastating different neurodegenerative or neurodevelopmental disorders might be to our brain's anatomy. So first we're looking at Alzheimer's, and hopefully you can appreciate the overall pattern of brain shrinkage and ventricle enlargement that you see, followed by chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE, which is a disease that often affects athletes who have a lot of head injuries. Finally, you can see a picture of a brain tumor here. So just to give you some different perspectives going into your future careers on what different models of brain disease might look like. So that's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and yeah.
So hopefully that video helped you understand the anatomy of the brain and spinal cord a bit more in depth. If you have any questions, you know where to find me, and without further ado, I just want to remind you all to stay safe, stay kind, and stay healthy, and I will see you in the next one.